To feed her children, a beggar woman agrees to bathe a blind millionaire. The blind millionaire despises her help, not knowing who she really is. But the truth between them could destroy everything. What he does will leave you in shock. The plane landed smoothly at the small Clear Springs airport. Elaine Mitchell adjusted the dark sunglasses that hid eyes reddened from sleepless nights. 20 years. 20 long years since she had left this town behind, swearing never to return. Now at 42, the successful executive who ran one of the country's largest architecture firms found herself forced to break that vow. Miss Elaine? A middle-aged man waited in the terminal with a sign bearing her name. I'm Augustus. From Mr. Matthew's office, he asked me to pick you up. Elaine nodded, following him silently to the car. The landscape that scrolled past the window was simultaneously familiar and strange. New buildings occupied spaces that were once just vacant lots, but the central square remained intact, as if time had stopped there. "Will you be staying at your mother's house?" asked Augustus, breaking the silence. "No." The response came out drier than she intended. "I'll stay at the Grand Hotel. I just need to resolve the estate matters and return to Boston." The driver didn't press the conversation. Elaine mentally thanked him for that as she checked messages on her phone. 3 postponed meetings, dozens of unanswered emails, and an important video conference scheduled for the next day. Everything would have to wait. The hotel was new, one of the symbols of the town's growth. Elaine checked in quickly and went up to her room. After a long shower, she sat on the balcony observing Clear Springs at dusk. Down below, life followed its normal course. People returning from work, children playing, couples walking hand in hand, a reality that was no longer hers. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Elaine? It's Matthew. Welcome back." "Thank you." She took a deep breath. "Can we meet early tomorrow? I want to resolve everything as quickly as possible." Of course, 9 o'clock at my office, but there was a hesitation on the other end of the line. "There are some complications we need to discuss in person." Complications? Wasn't the will clear? "Yes, but, well, we'll talk tomorrow. Get some rest." The call ended, leaving Elaine uneasy. What could possibly complicate the situation further? As far as she knew, the apartment in Boston and the house in Clear Springs were her mother's. Only assets. The division would be simple. Everything would go to her, an only child. The next morning, Elaine arrived punctually at the lawyer's office. Matthew Rivers, a longtime family friend, greeted her with a warm hug that she returned with a restrained smile. "You look exactly the same, Elaine. The years have been generous." "You look well too, Matthew." She sat down, getting straight to the point. "What are the complications you mentioned?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously. "It's about the old estate headquarters, that property at the entrance to town that's been in your family for generations." "The mansion?" Elaine frowned. "I thought it had been sold years ago." "No, your mother." Matthew hesitated. "She donated the property to the diocese about 5 years ago. The property now belongs to St. Francis Parish." The news hit Elaine like lightning. The mansion was a valuable property, with more than 2 acres in an area that had appreciated greatly with the town's growth. How could she donate it without consulting me? Elaine's voice barely disguised her indignation. "It was exclusively her property, Elaine. Legally, she didn't need your authorization." "And what did the church do with the mansion?" "They turned it into a community center. It serves underprivileged families, offers vocational courses. It's become an important place for the community." Elaine massaged her temples, trying to organize her thoughts. "Is there any way to reverse this donation?" Matthew seemed uncomfortable with the question. "Technically, yes. There are clauses in the contract that allow challenging the validity of the donation, especially if you claim that your mother wasn't of sound mind." "Was she?" "As far as I know, yes. But..." He paused. "Why don't you visit the place before making any decision? See what they've done there. Maybe that will help you understand Margaret's choices." Elaine agreed, more out of politeness than conviction. As she left the office, she decided to stop by the cemetery before visiting the mansion. She had been avoiding this moment since arriving, but now felt she needed to face the reality of her mother's absence. Before the simple tombstone, decorated with fresh flowers, Elaine felt the weight of all the years of distance. Tears came without warning, along with questions that would now go unanswered. Why the mansion? Why the church? What was her mother trying to say with that gesture? Wiping away her tears, Elaine made a decision. She would visit the mansion that afternoon and discover for herself what had happened to her family's property. Little did she know that this visit would completely change the course of her life. The Mitchell mansion remained imposing at the entrance to town, like a sentinel of time. The colonial facade, with its blue windows and white walls, had been carefully restored. A discreet sign identified the location as St. Francis Community Center. Elaine parked her rental car under the shade of a century-old almond tree and observed the movement of people entering and leaving the place. Groups of children played in the front garden under the supervision of volunteers. On the porch, elderly women gathered in a sewing circle. Her family's former home pulsed with life, so different from the memories she kept of the place, an austere and formal space where there was rarely laughter or loud voices. "Can I help? You?" A young woman of about 20 approached with a welcoming smile. "Saku," Elaine hesitated. "I'd like to see the center. I'm new in town." The lie came spontaneously. Something prevented her from revealing her true identity at that moment. "Of course. My name is Beth. I volunteer here. Come, I'll show you our facilities." Elaine followed the young woman through the spaces of the mansion, surprised by the transformation. The former living room was now a community library. The second-floor bedrooms had become classrooms. The kitchen, always the heart of the house, remained a gathering space, but now served meals for dozens of people daily. "Father Michael managed to transform this place into something amazing," Beth commented with evident admiration. "When he arrived at the parish 5 years ago, the center was just a project on paper. Today we serve more than 200 families." Father Michael. The name meant nothing to Elaine, but something in the way Beth pronounced it aroused her curiosity. "Yes, he should be in the chapel. It's a new part built at the back of the property. Would you like to see it?" Elaine nodded, following Beth along a stone path that cut through the garden. The small chapel was a simple but tasteful construction, with colored stained glass that filtered the sunlight, creating a welcoming atmosphere. "He usually stays here in the late afternoon, preparing his homily," whispered Beth, indicating a solitary figure kneeling before the altar. Elaine thanked the young woman and entered the chapel silently. Something about the man's posture seemed strangely familiar. He had his back to her, concentrated in prayer, apparently unaware of her presence. Elaine decided to wait, sitting in the last pew. The minutes passed slowly. The man finally stood up, and as he turned to leave, his eyes met Elaine's. The impact was immediate and devastating. "Michael?" The word escaped her lips like a sigh, as an avalanche of memories hit her mercilessly. Those green eyes. How could she forget? For 20 years she had tried to erase every detail of that face from her memory, and now he was there, wearing a cassock, looking as surprised as she was. "Elaine." His voice came out strangled, almost inaudible. The world seemed to disappear around them. 20 years vanished in an instant. In place of the respected priest and the successful businesswoman, there were just two people whose lives had been brutally separated by circumstances never explained. "What are you doing here?" he finally asked, his priestly composure gradually returning. "I could ask you the same thing." Elaine felt the anger, dormant for so many years, awakening within her. "But apparently you found a new vocation." Michael took 2 steps toward her, then stopped as if he had hit an invisible wall. "Elaine, He hesitated, words seeming inadequate before the abyss of time and secrets that separated them. "Father Michael." Beth's voice interrupted the moment as she hurriedly entered the chapel. "Sorry, I didn't know you were busy. Mrs. Bernice is here for the council meeting." Michael seemed momentarily relieved by the interruption. "Thank you, Beth. Tell her I'm coming." Turning to Elaine, he added in a low voice, "We need to talk. Please come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. Elaine wanted to refuse, wanted to say she had nothing to talk about with him, that 20 years was too long for any explanation to make sense, but the words didn't come out. She only nodded silently and turned to leave. "Elaine?" Michael called when she was already at the door. "Your mother, she talked about you a lot." The mention of her mother felt like a punch to the stomach. Elaine left the chapel without responding, walking quickly to her car. Inside, she finally allowed herself to release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Michael. Her Michael. The same man who had once been her husband, her companion, her entire world. The man who had disappeared without a trace, leaving her with a broken heart and unanswered questions. Now a priest, running a community center in the mansion that had belonged to her family. Elaine's head spun, with questions and theories. Did her mother know? Of course she did. The donation of the mansion, the involvement with the church, it all made terrible sense now. But why? Why had her mother never told her? Why had Michael never sought her out? What had happened in those 20 years to transform the ambitious young architect into a dedicated priest? At the hotel, Elaine couldn't sleep. Images of the past mixed with the revelations of the present, forming an incomplete puzzle. She remembered the day Michael simply didn't come home, the unanswered calls, the empty apartment when she arrived from work, the anguish of the days. That followed. The fruitless search, the missing person report that never amounted to anything. She thought of her mother, who had insisted that she start life anew, who had encouraged her to move to Boston to focus on her career. Had it all been part of a larger plan? The next morning, Elaine woke up determined. She wouldn't return to the mansion. She would contact the lawyer and start the process to reverse the donation. She would sell the property to the first interested party and return to her life in Boston, leaving Clear Springs and its ghosts behind for good. But as she picked up the phone to call Matthew, she hesitated. The images of children playing in the garden, of the elderly women on the porch, of the community benefiting from the center came to her mind, and above all, the image of Michael, kneeling in prayer, a man transformed by time and by choices she knew nothing about. Elaine put the phone back on the nightstand. She needed answers before making any decision, and there was only one person who could provide them. At precisely 10 o'clock, Elaine crossed the gates of St. Francis Community Center. Unlike the day before, she opted for a more formal outfit, black blazer and pants that emphasized her executive posture, armor for the confrontation that approached. The mansion seemed quieter that morning. The children were probably in school, and the vocational courses would only start in the afternoon, according to Beth. Elaine headed directly to the small annex, building that served as the center's administrative office. A gray-haired woman with a shrewd look greeted her with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" "I have a meeting scheduled with Father Michael." The woman examined her from head to toe, not disguising her curiosity. "Your name, please." "Elaine Mitchell." The recognition was immediate. The woman's expression visibly hardened. "Ah, Margaret's daughter." Her tone was that of someone who finally put a face to a name long heard. "I'm Bernice Fields, administrative coordinator of the center. Father Michael mentioned you would come. Please follow me." Elaine followed Bernice down a hallway to a simple but organized room. A wooden desk, a few chairs, bookshelves with books and folders. On the wall, a crucifix and a framed photo showing the inauguration of the center, with Michael cutting the ribbon alongside a woman Elaine immediately recognized, her mother. "He'll be here shortly." Bernice indicated a chair. "Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you." The woman hesitated at the door as if wanting to say something more. Finally, with a contained sigh, she commented, "Your mother was a great benefactor to this community. We deeply feel her loss." Before Elaine could respond, Bernice left, closing the door behind her. Less than a minute later, Michael entered, now wearing a black dress shirt with the characteristic clerical collar. "Thank you for coming." He sat, on the other side of the desk, maintaining a safe distance. His eyes, however, couldn't hide the whirlwind of emotions that her presence provoked. "I didn't come for you." Elaine's voice came out controlled, cold. "I came because I need to understand what happened to my family's mansion." Michael nodded slowly. "I understand. Where would you like to begin?" The beginning would be good. How did you end up here? How did my mother decide to donate a valuable property to the church? And most importantly, why did I never know anything about this? Michael interlaced his fingers on the desk, searching for the right words. I arrived in Clear Springs 7 years ago, already as a deacon. Priestly ordination came shortly after. It was a coincidence, believe me. I didn't know your mother still lived here. He paused. We met during a fundraising campaign for the renovation of the main church. She recognized me immediately. And you? I recognized her too. How could I forget the mother of the woman who... He let the sentence die in the air. At first, she avoided me. Then, she sought me out for confession. It was a difficult moment for both of us. Elaine felt a lump in her throat, imagining the meeting between her mother and Michael after so many years. And then? Gradually, Margaret drew closer to the parish. She started participating in activities, contributing financially. When I presented the community center project, she was the first to support it. Michael opened a folder on the desk, showing documents. The initial idea was to buy land, but prices were beyond our means. That's when she offered the mansion. Just like that, simply. Elaine couldn't hide her skepticism. No, it wasn't simple. Michael ran his hand through his hair, a familiar gesture that hit Elaine like an arrow from the past. There were conditions. The property should be used exclusively for social purposes, could never be sold by the church, and your name should never be mentioned in connection with the donation. He looked at her directly. She didn't want you to know about my presence here. The revelation produced a heavy silence between them. Elaine tried to process the information, connect the dots of a story that seemed increasingly obscure. Why? Would she do that? Why hide it from me? Michael looked away for the first time. Your mother believed it would be better that way, that you had suffered enough. Suffered? Elaine felt her indignation grow. Is that what you call what happened? You disappeared from my life, Michael, vanished without a word, without an explanation. I looked for you in hospitals, police stations. I thought of every possible scenario. Elaine, And now I discover that my own mother knew about you for years and never told me anything. She stood up abruptly. What kind of cruelty is that? Michael also stood up, his expression distressed. It wasn't cruelty, it was protection, both on her part and mine. Protection? Elaine laughed humorlessly. From what exactly were you protecting me? Before Michael could answer, the door opened and Bernice entered hurriedly. Sorry for the interruption, but we have a situation in the main hall. Mr. Reynolds just arrived with his lawyer. Michael's face paled. Victor is here now? Yes, and he's demanding to speak with you. He said it's about the purchase proposal. Elaine observed the dynamic between the two, intrigued by the evident tension in Michael's voice when mentioning this Victor. Who is Victor Reynolds? She asked when Bernice left again. Michael took a deep breath, composing himself. A local businessman, he's been interested in the mansion grounds for years, made several offers to the diocese, all refused. And why would he be here now? Probably because he heard about your arrival. Michael looked at her seriously. Clear Springs is still a small town, Elaine. News travels fast, especially when it involves the Mitchell heiress and a valuable property. Elaine felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something Michael wasn't telling her, something between the lines of every word. You still haven't answered my question. She moved closer to him, reducing the distance he had so carefully maintained. From what exactly were you protecting me? Michael held her gaze for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. From the truth, Elaine, the truth about what really happened 20 years ago. The main hall of the mansion, formerly the Mitchell family's ballroom, now served as a multi-purpose space for the community center. Large windows allowed abundant natural light to enter, illuminating the newly painted walls and restored wooden floor. In the center of the hall, a man of approximately 60, elegantly dressed in a gray suit, gestured. While talking to Bernice, at his side, a young man in a dark suit held a folder of documents. When Elaine and Michael entered the hall, the man interrupted his speech and turned to face them. His eyes, small and shrewd, fixed first on Michael with evident hostility, then slid to Elaine with a disturbing interest. "Father Michael, what a pleasure to see you again." The sarcasm in his voice was palpable. "And this must be the illustrious Elaine Mitchell. The resemblance to Margaret is remarkable." Michael took a step forward, subtly placing himself between Elaine and the visitor. "Victor, we didn't schedule any meeting. If you want to discuss any matter, I ask that you make an appropriate appointment." Victor Reynolds smiled, deliberately ignoring Michael's firm tone. "Times have changed, Father. Now we have the legitimate owner of the property present." He extended his hand to Elaine. "Victor Reynolds, the largest real estate developer in the region. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Elaine shook the offered hand, feeling immediate discomfort. There was something predatory in Victor's gaze, as if he were evaluating her not as a person, but as a piece in a game. "The pleasure is mine. But I'm afraid you're mistaken. The property was legally donated to the church." "Ah, but donations can be contested, can't they?" Victor gestured to the young man at his side, who promptly opened the folder and removed some documents. "This is my lawyer, Mr. Paul. He has prepared a complete dossier on the legal possibilities for reversing the donation." Elaine took the papers offered, more out of politeness than real interest. Her instinct told her not to trust this man. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Reynolds, but I'm already properly advised by Mr. Matthew Rivers." "Matthew?" Victor laughed. "A provincial lawyer who never left this town. I'm sure he hasn't properly explained all your options to you." "And what would those be?" asked Elaine, crossing her arms in a defensive posture. Victor looked around, as if assessing the environment. "This place has extraordinary potential. Prime location, extensive grounds, historic building. My company is developing a high-end complex, and this would be the perfect location for the boutique hotel that's part of the project." He paused dramatically. "I'm willing to offer $10 million for the property, cash." The amount mentioned was exorbitant, far above market value, even considering the area's appreciation. Elaine saw Michael pale beside her. "As I said, Mr. Reynolds, the property is not for sale." She returned the documents to the lawyer. "It was donated for a specific purpose. Donated under questionable circumstances." Victor took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "Your mother wasn't well in her final years, Elaine. People close to her noticed strange behaviors. It wouldn't be difficult to argue that she was unduly influenced." Michael intervened, his voice trembling slightly with contained indignation. "That's a serious and completely unfounded accusation. Margaret was perfectly lucid when she made the donation." "Was she?" Victor took a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to Elaine. "Perhaps Miss Mitchell would like to check these medical records before being so sure." Elaine opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, she found copies of medical prescriptions and a partial report with the letterhead of a neurological clinic. Her mother's name was clearly visible, along with technical terms suggesting some cognitive condition. "How did you get this?" Her voice came out weaker than she would have liked. "I have my resources." Victor smiled, satisfied with the effect caused. "The question is, did your mother really know what she was doing when she gave a property of this value to the church? Or was she manipulated by people who had an interest in controlling this location?" The accusatory look he directed at Michael made the insinuation clear. Elaine felt a wave of nausea as she realized the implications. Was her mother really ill? Had Michael taken advantage of her vulnerable condition? "I think that's enough, Victor." Bernice's voice cut through the tense air of the hall. The woman, who had been observing the scene in silence until then, stepped forward with a severe expression. "You have no right to invade the center with these infamous insinuations." Victor turned to Bernice with a sarcastic smile. "Bernice, always the faithful defender of the priest. Touching, really. But perhaps you should tell Miss Mitchell about your personal interest in this story." Bernice's face flushed violently. Elaine, perceiving the growing hostility, decided to take control of the situation. "Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate your offer, but I need time to analyze the situation as a whole. Please leave your card with your lawyer, and I promise to contact you when I have an answer." Victor seemed momentarily surprised by Elaine's firm posture, but quickly regained his composure. "As you wish." He handed her a gold business card. "My offer has a deadline, Elaine. 1 week. After that, the value drops by half, and my lawyers will file a petition contesting the donation, with or without your consent." "Is that a threat?" asked Michael, indignation finally escaping his careful control. "I prefer to call it pragmatic. Negotiation, Father." Victor adjusted his jacket with a studied gesture. After all, everyone here has something to lose if this story goes public, some more than others. With these enigmatic words, he motioned to his lawyer, and both headed for the exit. At the last moment, Victor turned to Elaine. "By the way, I'm hosting a dinner at my home tonight. It would be an honor to have your presence. We can discuss business in a more pleasant environment." Elaine felt Michael's concerned gaze upon her. "I'll consider your invitation, Mr. Reynolds." When the businessman finally left, a heavy silence fell over the hall. Bernice was the first to break it. "You shouldn't listen to that man, Elaine. Victor Reynolds is known for his questionable methods, and you're known for your loyalty to the priest, from what I understand." Elaine couldn't help but notice how Bernice placed herself protectively beside Michael. What personal interest did he mention? Bernice and Michael exchanged tense looks. It was he who answered. "Bernice and her family are beneficiaries of the center. Her youngest son participates in the educational program we maintain here. Victor knows that if the center closes, many families will be affected." The explanation seemed reasonable, but Elaine felt there was more to that story than they were willing to reveal. She decided not to press for now. "I need to verify these medical documents." She put the envelope in her purse. "If my mother really was having cognitive problems, that changes everything." Dr. Edward Foster's office maintained the same austere air that Elaine remembered from her childhood. Located in an old mansion in the center of town, the space seemed immune to the passage of time, with its dark wooden furniture and landscape paintings on the walls. The doctor, now with completely white hair, received Elaine with the familiarity of someone who had accompanied generations of the same family. "My dear, it's good to see you." He took Elaine's hands in his. "I deeply lament your mother's passing. Margaret was an extraordinary woman." "Thank you, Doctor." Elaine sat in the indicated chair. "I need to talk about a delicate matter." Without beating around the bush, she placed on the desk the envelope with the documents delivered by Victor Reynolds. Dr. Edward examined the papers, frowning as he turned the pages. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked. "Does that matter? What I need to know is, are these documents legitimate? Did my mother really suffer from some neurological condition?" The doctor sighed, taking off his glasses to clean them, a gesture that Elaine recognized as a sign of discomfort. "Your mother consulted Dr. Menezes, a neurologist, yes. There were some complaints of forgetfulness, memory lapses, common things for her age. And the diagnosis? Nothing conclusive. More specific tests were recommended, but she never took them." The doctor returned the papers to Elaine. "These documents are partial, Elaine. They show only the beginning of an investigation that was never completed. Using this to question Margaret's mental capacity would be, at the very least, unethical." Elaine felt a mixture of relief and frustration. The possibility of invalidating the donation based on her mother's mental incapacity seemed increasingly remote. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of indignation, thinking that her mother might have faced health problems without her knowledge. Why did she never tell me about these consultations? Margaret was always reserved about her health. The doctor smiled sadly. "And you were far away, building your life in Boston. She didn't want to be a burden." "I would have come back if I had known." "She knew that. Maybe that's precisely why she never told you." Elaine left the office with more questions than answers. The afternoon was already falling when she decided to make a visit she had been postponing since her arrival. The house, where she grew up, and where her mother had lived until her final days. The Mitchell residence, unlike the colonial mansion that now served as a community center, was a more modern construction designed by Elaine's father in the 1980s. Located in an upscale neighborhood of Clear Springs, the house with contemporary lines stood out in the urban landscape for its discreet elegance. Matthew had given her the keys the day before, but Elaine hadn't found the strength to enter there alone. Now, standing in front of the gate, she felt the weight of the memories that place held. The house was impeccably clean and organized, as if waiting for her arrival. In the entrance hall, family photographs aligned on the walls. Elaine as a child, teenager at graduation, and, to her surprise, recent photographs of herself, taken from magazines and newspapers where she appeared at business events. Her mother had followed her career from a distance, proudly collecting every mention of her daughter in the media. On the coffee table in the living room, an open photo album showed images of the mansion transformed into a community center. Her mother appeared in several of them, always alongside Michael. In one of the photos, the two smiled broadly while cutting an inaugural ribbon. On the back, a date, 5 years ago. Elaine sat on the sofa, absorbing the silence of the house. Why had her mother invested so much in that project? Why had she chosen to work precisely with Michael? The coincidence seemed too improbable. The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Opening the door, she found Bernice standing on the porch, holding a small basket covered with an embroidered cloth. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." The woman seemed uncomfortable, very different from the assertive person Elaine had met at the center. "I heard you would be coming to the house today and thought of bringing some muffins. They were your mother's favorites." Elaine hesitated for a moment, surprised by the unexpected kindness, but ended up inviting Bernice in the kitchen, while they prepared tea to accompany the muffins. The tension between the two women gradually diminished. "Did you know my mother well?" Elaine finally asked. "For the last 5 years, yes. We became friends since she started participating in parish activities." Bernice smiled slightly. Margaret was a reserved woman, but with strong opinions. "Sounds like her." "You're like that too." Bernice observed her with attentive eyes. "She talked about you a lot, you know. Always with pride." "Funny, because we had a complicated relationship." "Complicated how?" The question came out naturally without the intention of intrusion. Elaine sighed, absently stirring her tea with the spoon. "After Michael disappeared, I became a different person, more closed off, more focused on work. My mother insisted that I move on, meet other people. We had some ugly arguments about that." "And you never moved on?" "Professionally, yes. Personally," Elaine shrugged. "Let's say I never found a reason strong enough." Bernice nodded, understanding. After a moment of silence, she commented, "Michael never got over the past either. The priesthood was a way to channel the pain, I believe." Elaine felt a sudden irritation at the mention of Michael's suffering. He had no right to suffer. He was the one who left after all. "Things aren't always what they seem, Elaine, no." "What does that mean?" Bernice seemed to hesitate, as if carefully measuring her next words. "I don't think I'm the right person to explain, but know that your mother and Michael had a common goal in working together at the center, to create something positive from a story marked by external interference." "Interference from whom?" "Ask Michael, or better yet, ask Victor Reynolds." Bernice's tone hardened at mentioning the businessman. "He has more participation in this story than you imagine." Before Elaine could insist, Bernice consulted her watch and stood up hurriedly. "I need to go. My son is waiting for me." She hesitated at the kitchen door. "Just one more thing. Are you going to Victor's dinner tonight?" "I haven't decided yet." "If you go, be careful. Victor is a dangerous man, especially for people who stand between him and what he wants." With these enigmatic words, Bernice said goodbye, leaving Elaine with the uncomfortable feeling of only scratching the surface of a much deeper mystery. What did Victor Reynolds really want with that property, and what was his connection to Michael's disappearance 20 years ago? The decision formed in her mind as she finished her tea. She would go to Victor's dinner. It was time to look the adversary in the eye and find out what game he was playing. Victor Reynolds' mansion sat on a hilltop on the outskirts of Clear Springs, with a privileged view of the entire town. The imposing construction, a mix of contemporary architecture with classical elements, was surrounded by an extensive, meticulously maintained garden. Strategically positioned lights highlighted the elegant lines of the building, and created illuminated paths between the sculptures and fountains scattered throughout the grounds. Elaine parked her rental car alongside several other luxury vehicles and adjusted the black dress she had chosen for the occasion, sober, elegant, and above all a psychological armor. She had decided to attend the dinner without alerting Michael or Bernice. She needed to confront Victor Reynolds alone and draw her own conclusions. A butler received her at the entrance and led her through a spacious hall decorated with visibly expensive works of art. Most of the guests had already arrived. Elaine recognized some prominent figures from town, including politicians, businessmen, and local socialites. She felt curious glances when she was announced, but maintained the dignified posture she was accustomed to at corporate events. Victor came to meet her immediately, displaying a smile that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Elaine, what a wonderful surprise." He took her hand and kissed it with theatrical formality. "I confess I wasn't sure if you would accept my invitation." Curiosity spoke louder, Mr. Reynolds. "Please, Victor." He offered her a glass of champagne. "Allow me to introduce you to some friends." During the next half hour, Elaine was guided from group to group, introduced as the Mitchell heiress and a brilliant businesswoman from Boston. Victor made a point of mentioning that she was reconsidering the fate of the historic mansion, provoking enthusiastic reactions from those present, many of whom expressed support for the idea of the boutique hotel. "It would be great for the local economy," commented a city councilman, raising his glass in a toast. "The community center is admirable, no doubt, but we need to think about the progress of the town. Father Michael does laudable work, but that space has potential for much more," added an elegant lady, wife of a local banker. "Besides, the church has so many other properties." Elaine smiled politely but avoided making commitments. She carefully observed the group dynamics, noticing how Victor seemed to have won over the town's elite. His project was discussed as something already decided, just waiting for the last bureaucratic details. When dinner was announced, Victor strategically positioned Elaine to his right at the head of the table. The meal, served on fine china and gleaming crystal, was elaborate and impeccable. International cuisine dishes prepared by a private chef. "So, Elaine," Victor approached her when dessert was served, "what did you think of my proposal?" "I'm still considering all options," she replied, maintaining a neutral tone. $10 million is an impressive amount, but the sentimental value of the property also weighs in the decision." "Sentimental value?" Victor laughed softly, as if he found the idea charming but naive. "I imagined that a successful businesswoman like you would make more pragmatic decisions. Pragmatism also involves considering all relevant factors." She looked at him directly, "including understanding why someone would offer far above market value for a property." "Vision, my dear." Victor lowered his voice, leaning slightly toward her. "Clear Springs is about to become the region's next luxury tourist destination. I have plans that will completely transform the local economy. Your mansion is just one piece of the puzzle, but a strategic piece." "And the community center?" "It can be easily relocated." He made a dismissive gesture. "In fact, I've already discussed with the mayor the possibility of providing municipal land for this purpose. Everyone wins. Everyone except the people who depend on that specific space." Victor studied her for a moment, as if evaluating a new strategy. "After dinner, I'd like to show you something in my office. Perhaps it will help clarify certain aspects of the situation." The dinner continued amid pleasant conversations and polite laughter. Elaine, however, felt increasingly uncomfortable, as if she were on a stage playing a role in a play whose script she didn't know. When guests began to disperse to the lounges for coffee, Victor discreetly led Elaine to a side corridor of the mansion. His private office occupied an entire wing of the second floor, an imposing environment, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a marble fireplace, and an impressive desk carved from noble wood. "Please, sit down." He indicated a leather armchair, while serving 2 glasses of cognac. "I'd like to talk about your ex-husband." Elaine felt a chill run down her spine. How did Victor know that detail of her past? "Michael and I divorced a long time ago." "Divorced?" Victor raised his eyebrows, surprised. Interesting. I always thought he had simply disappeared. It's complicated. Elaine accepted the glass, but didn't drink. What does Michael have to do with your proposal for the mansion? Victor walked to a painting on the wall and moved it, revealing a built-in safe. He typed a combination, opened the metal door, and removed a yellowed folder. I met your ex-husband 20 years ago, did you know? He slowly leafed through the folder. A talented young architect full of dreams, he had designed a resort for my company, his first big job. Elaine felt her heart race. Michael had never mentioned this project. Continue. The resort would be built exactly where the mansion stands today. Victor removed from the folder a set of architectural plans that he spread on the desk. See, the project was magnificent. But there was a problem. Your family refused to sell the property. Your father was intransigent about it. My father loved that place. It was the heritage of generations. Yes, well, sentiments are complicators in business. Victor smiled coldly. Michael, however, believed he could convince him. After all, he was part of the family. He never told me about this. No? Victor seemed genuinely surprised. Curious. The project meant so much to him. It was his big chance to establish himself as an architect. He even made several versions of the plans, trying to incorporate elements of the original construction to please your father. Elaine examined the drawings, immediately recognizing Michael's style. The precise lines, the meticulous annotations in the margins, everything screamed his name. How had she never known about this project? What happened next? Victor closed the folder with a studied movement. Your father fell ill. The project was shelved, and Michael made some difficult decisions. What kind of decisions? The ones a man makes when he's between professional ambition and personal loyalties. Victor sat on the edge of the desk, too close to Elaine. You know what intrigues me? How he reappeared years later as a priest, precisely in Clear Springs. And how your mother, who was never particularly religious, suddenly decided to donate a valuable property to his church. Are you insinuating something, Mr. Reynolds? Insinuating? No, dear. He smiled, his cold eyes fixed on hers. I'm explicitly saying that there's more to this story than you know. Secrets that your ex-husband prefers to keep buried under the mantle of holiness. Elaine stood up, feeling suffocated by Victor's proximity and the implications of his words. Thank you for dinner and for the enlightening conversation. But I need to go now. Of course. Victor made no move to stop her. Think carefully. Elaine, 10 million is a lot of money, and some truths once revealed cannot be undone. On the way back to the hotel, Elaine couldn't get the images of the architectural plans out of her mind. Why had Michael never mentioned that project? And what was the connection between the unbuilt resort and his sudden disappearance? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image they formed was too disturbing to accept without questioning. The next morning dawned gray in Clear Springs, with heavy clouds promising rain. Elaine awoke after a night of restless dreams, fragments of the past mixing with new revelations in a confusing sequence of images. At breakfast, she only pushed the food around on her plate, unable to swallow anything while her mind worked incessantly. Gradually, a dull anger took over, anger at Michael for his secrets, at her mother for her complicit silence, at Victor for his evident manipulation, and above all, at herself for not having perceived before the pieces of the puzzle that now seemed so obvious. Seized by a sudden determination, Elaine drove to St. Francis Parish. Unlike the community centre, the main church was an old construction in the heart of town, its twin towers dominating the central square. The silent interior, illuminated only by light filtered through the stained glass windows, was empty at that hour of the morning, except for an elderly woman praying in a front pew. Elaine found Michael in the sacristy, organizing liturgical vestments. He seemed genuinely surprised by her presence. Elaine, did something happen? Without answering, she closed the sacristy door and turned to face him, her expression hard. I want the truth, Michael, all of it. No half words, no convenient omissions. What are you talking about? about the resort project, about the mansion, about your disappearance, about everything you and my mother hid from me for 2 decades. Michael visibly paled, leaning on a nearby table. How did you discover this? I had dinner with Victor Reynolds last night. He made a point of showing me the architectural plans you drew. Very impressive, I must say. Elaine crossed her arms, containing the urge to scream. How could you, Michael? How could you design a resort for my family's land without ever telling me? I was going to tell you. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that Elaine knew well. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment. Her voice rose dangerously. And when would that be? Before or after our wedding? Before or after my father passed away? Or perhaps there would never be a right moment. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if seeking strength to face a long-buried truth. It was my first big project, Elaine. Even before I met you, Victor hired me when I was still newly graduated. He paused, organizing his thoughts. When I started dating you, I didn't make the immediate connection. Mitchell is a common surname, and you never talked much about the mansion, which was practically abandoned at the time. Continue. When I realized I was designing a resort for the property of my girlfriend's family, I was already deeply involved. Victor knew, of course. I believe that's why he hired me to begin with. He thought my relationship with you could facilitate the negotiation. And you accepted using our relationship that way? The pain in Elaine's voice was palpable. No! Michael took a step toward her but retreated when he saw her closed expression. I told Victor I wouldn't use our relationship to influence your family, but I also didn't abandon the project. It was my big professional chance, you understand? I naively believed I could separate things. Elaine shook her head, incredulous. When your father fell ill, I realized how much the mansion meant to your family. Michael continued. He called me to his bedside, you know, asked me to promise to take care of the property, keep it in the family. He didn't know about the project, but something in him, I think he intuited. And you promised? Yes. Michael lowered his eyes. I promised. And when I returned to the office to inform Victor that I was abandoning the project, he didn't react well. Elaine felt a chill, remembering Victor's cold look the night before. What did he do? He threatened to ruin my career before it even started. Said he had connections with all the major architecture firms, that I would never get a significant project again. Michael took a deep breath. I ignored the threats. Then he changed tactics. He started insinuating that he had compromising information about your father, about old Mitchell family business dealings. What kind of information? I never knew for sure. Victor is a master of vague insinuations that seem like concrete threats. But you knew your father, Elaine. He was a man of integrity, but also a small-town businessman in the 80s and 90s. There were many gray areas in business back then. Elaine nodded slowly. Her father had never been rich but maintained a comfortable standard of living with his various enterprises. And then your father passed away and the pressure increased. Michael looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Victor sought me out on the day of the funeral, said it was my last chance to convince your mother to sell the property. And you refused? Yes. I sent him away, said I never wanted to see him again. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call. A distorted voice, explicit threats to your safety. Michael's voice trembled slightly. Not just to your life, but to your reputation, your future. The message was clear. If I didn't disappear, you would suffer the consequences. The silence that followed was dense, as heavy as the clouds that now darkened the sky of Clear Springs. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you go to the police? I tried. Michael smiled bitterly. I went to the police station, filed a report. The sheriff was Victor's friend. The next day I received another call with details of what I had said at the station. The message was even more threatening. So you simply disappeared? It wasn't simple, Elaine. It was the hardest decision of my life. His voice broke. But at that moment, I believed it was the only way to protect you. Elaine felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of anger and pain that had been dammed up for 2 decades. And my mother, how did she enter this story? Years later, when I returned as a deacon, she recognized me. At first, she refused to speak to me. Then, one day after a mass, she sought me out. Said she had pieces of the puzzle that I didn't possess. Information about Victor Reynolds that explained his obsession with the mansion. Michael hesitated. It was she who suggested the idea of the community center, a way to protect the property, using the church as a shield against Victor. Rain finally poured down on Clear Springs, drumming on the sacristy roof. Elaine watched the drops running down the small window, trying to organize the whirlwind of revelations. Michael remained silent, giving her the necessary space to process everything she had just heard. "What information did my mother have about Victor?" she finally asked, turning to Michael. "She never told me completely." He hesitated. Margaret was cautious, revealed only what was necessary. She said there was a document, something that compromised Victor, related to how he acquired his first properties in town. "And where is this document?" "I don't know. I believe she kept it somewhere safe." Elaine frowned, thoughtful. Her mother had always been methodical, organized. If there was something important, it would be stored carefully, but also in an accessible place in case of need. Why did she never use this information directly against Victor? Fear, perhaps. Michael shrugged. Or strategy. Margaret believed that as long as Victor thought she could expose him, he would maintain a certain distance, a kind of stalemate. And the donation of the mansion? It was her idea. Transforming the property into a community center linked to the church would create an additional layer of protection. Victor could pressure an individual, but confronting the diocese would be more complicated, especially with public opinion involved. Elaine nodded slowly, recognizing her mother's astuteness. The plan was intelligent, using Victor's own ambition against him, transforming the property into something that would generate negative repercussions if it were appropriated. Why did she never tell me? Why keep me in the dark for so many years? Michael sighed, his eyes reflecting the same pain she had seen in Margaret so many times. She feared you would return to Clear Springs, that you would get involved in this battle. You had built a new life in Boston, away from Victor's threats. She wanted to keep you safe. It wasn't her decision. Elaine felt anger growing again. She had no right to choose for me. I agree, I told her that several times. Michael smiled sadly. Your mother was stubborn, just like you. Just like all three of us. A silence established itself between them, no longer filled with hostility, but with a mutual understanding of what they had lost, of the irretrievable years that had passed separated by choices made under pressure and fear. Why did you never seek me out afterward? Elaine finally asked. When the threats diminished, when you were already protected by the priesthood. Michael looked away, the guilt evident on his face. At first, it was fear. Then, he hesitated. Shame. Cowardice. Time passed, and the more distant it became, the more impossible it seemed to turn back. And then I met your mother again, and she told me how much you had suffered, how you had closed yourself off. I thought that reappearing after so long would only reopen wounds. It wasn't your decision to make, Elaine repeated, but now her voice sounded more tired than angry. I know, I'm sorry, Elaine, more than I can express. Elaine's cell phone vibrated, interrupting the moment. It was a message from Matthew, the lawyer. We need to talk urgently about the mansion. Victor Reynolds has filed a lawsuit contesting the donation. Problems? Asked Michael, noticing her concerned expression. Victor isn't wasting time. She showed him the message. It seems our conversation yesterday made him more aggressive. Michael frowned, thoughtful. He must be worried that you'll discover the document your mother kept. He's accelerating things to force a quick decision. What document could be so important after so many years? I'm not sure, but your mother once mentioned it was related to the purchase of Victor's first lands in the region, lands that coincidentally surround the mansion. Elaine felt the pieces slowly falling into place. We need to find this document before Victor makes his next move. Do you think it's in your mother's house? I'm almost certain. Elaine was already grabbing her purse, determined. She always kept important documents in a specific place. Michael stood up, visibly anxious. "I want to help, Elaine. Should I go with you?" She hesitated, studying the man before her. He was no longer the young husband she had known, nor the distant priest she had met days ago. He was someone in between, a man marked by time and difficult choices, just as she was herself. Yes, the decision surprised them both. "I think we need to face this together." In Margaret Mitchell's house, the silence was broken only by the sound of rain on the windows and the occasional distant thunder. Elaine guided Michael down the hallway to her mother's office, a small but meticulously organized room with bookshelves, an antique desk, and a safe embedded in the wall. "The safe?" asked Michael. "That would be too obvious." Elaine shook her head. "My mother was smarter than that." She approached a particular bookshelf where leather-bound volumes were aligned in chronological order. Margaret Mitchell's diaries, a habit she had maintained for decades. She wrote everything, from everyday thoughts to deep reflections. Elaine ran her fingers along the spines. If there was something important, it would be encoded here. She removed the most recent volume, corresponding to the last months of her mother's life. The pages were filled with Margaret's elegant and firm handwriting, without signs of the cognitive deterioration that Victor had insinuated. "It doesn't look like the writing of someone with neurological problems," commented Michael, looking over Elaine's shoulder. "Exactly what I thought." Elaine slowly leafed through the diary, reading random excerpts that talked about the community center, chemotherapy sessions, and, to her surprise, frequent mentions of herself, concerns about her well-being, joy in reading about her professional achievements, and a recurring desire for reconciliation. "She missed you," murmured Michael, "and I was too busy to visit her." Elaine's voice broke. "Too busy nursing old resentments." The last pages of the diary contained shorter notes reflecting Margaret's growing fatigue. And then, in the penultimate entry, a phrase caught Elaine's attention. "If something happens to me, Elaine will find the truth where we always kept our most precious treasures. The childhood box holds more than memories." "The childhood box," Elaine repeated, feeling a shiver of recognition. "My God, how didn't I think of this before?" She hurriedly left the office, heading to her old bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it 20 years ago. Under the bed, a hand-painted wooden box, a gift from her father when she turned 10. With trembling fingers, Elaine opened the box that contained relics of her childhood, yellowed photographs, colored ribbons, small sports medals. At the bottom, under a faded silk scarf, she found a sealed envelope with the local notary's seal and her name written in her mother's unmistakable handwriting. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Elaine carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents, a letter addressed to her and an old land deed dated more than 30 years ago. "What is this?" asked Michael, sitting beside her. "I'm not sure." Elaine began to read. Her mother's letter, her voice trembling slightly. "My dear Elaine, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there. And finally you have come home. There is so much I need to tell you, so many truths I have kept for far too long." Elaine took a deep breath and continued reading her mother's letter, each word revealing long-kept secrets. "My dear Elaine, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there, and finally, you have come home. There is so much I need to tell you, so many truths I have kept for far too long. The document that accompanies this letter is proof of a crime committed 3 decades ago, a forged deed that gave Victor Reynolds control over lands that didn't legitimately belong to him, lands that ironically surround our mansion on all sides. To understand the importance of this, I need to tell a story that begins even before your birth. Your father and Victor were childhood friends. They grew up together, studied together, dreamed together about the development of Clear Springs. But while your father believed in sustainable growth, historic preservation, and community development, Victor saw only opportunities for quick profit. The first major divergence between them occurred when Victor proposed buying the Martinez family lands, an extensive property that surrounded our mansion. The Martinez family was in financial difficulty, and Victor wanted to acquire everything for a fraction of the real value. Your father intervened, convincing the Martinez family to sell only a part and keep the rest for their heirs. Victor never forgave him for that. The rivalry that followed gradually transformed into something darker. When years later, the last of the Martinez family died without known heirs, Victor saw his opportunity. Using falsified documents, he claimed the entire property, including parts that had been legally sold to small local producers. Your father discovered the fraud. He had proof, the original deed that you now possess, with the correct boundaries and authenticated signatures. He confronted Victor, threatening to expose him. Days later, he suffered his first stroke. It was considered a natural vascular accident, but I always had my doubts. When your father realized he wouldn't fully recover, he entrusted me with the document and made me promise that I would protect the mansion at all costs. It was more than a matter of property. It was a matter of justice. For years I kept this secret, using it as a shield against Victor's advances. He knew I possessed the document, but he didn't know where I kept it, a stalemate that kept us in a cautious dance for decades. Then Michael returned to town. Initially, I confess, I suspected him. I believed he might be Victor's pawn strategically, positioned to gain my trust. But I soon realized my mistake. Michael had suffered as much as you from Victor's manipulations. The idea of the community center was born from our conversations, a way to protect the mansion, giving it a purpose that transcended commercial interests. The donation to the diocese was calculated, creating institutional barriers that Victor would have difficulty overcoming. Now you must be wondering, why did I never tell you? Why didn't I bring you back so we could face this together? The answer is simple and selfish: fear. Fear that Victor would do to you what I suspected he had done to your father. Fear of dragging you into a battle that wasn't yours. And, I admit, fear of losing you completely, by revealing how I allowed your marriage to be destroyed by threats that perhaps we could have faced together. Michael wanted to seek you out many times. I convinced him it was better to leave you in peace, building your new life away from this conflict. Now I realize that perhaps it was a mistake, that we had the right to try to restore what was broken, even with scars. The cancer caught me by surprise. When I realized its severity, it was too late to undo years of silence with a simple phone call. So I prepared this package, trusting that after my departure, you would return at least to resolve practical matters. Knowing you, I knew you wouldn't rest until discovering the truth. The choice is now yours, daughter. The document in your hands can ruin Victor Reynolds. But using it means confronting a dangerous man who hasn't hesitated to destroy lives that stood in his way. Whatever your decision, know that I loved you deeply, even when my silence may have suggested otherwise, and that your father would be proud of the strong woman you've become. With eternal love, your mother, Margaret. The silence that followed the reading was dense, filled with contained emotions. Elaine felt tears freely streaming down her face, not just for the loss of her mother, but for the revelation of a much larger story than she had imagined, a story in which everyone was, to some degree, victims and perpetrators. She knew, murmured Michael, his voice breaking. She suspected that your father's stroke hadn't been natural. That's a very serious accusation. Elaine wiped away her tears, now examining the second document. The old deed clearly showed different boundaries than Victor's current properties, with careful annotations made in the margin by her father's hand. If this is true, Victor not only falsified documents but may have... She couldn't complete the sentence. The implication was too heavy. We need to take this to the authorities, said Michael. Which authorities? Elaine laughed humorlessly. You yourself said the local police had connections with Victor, and this document is more than 30 years old. Even if we can prove the falsification, the statute of limitations for fraud has expired. But if there's evidence that he harmed your father, proving that after so many years would be almost impossible. Elaine carefully folded the documents. My mother kept this as protection, not as a weapon. And now? Elaine stood up, a new determination in her eyes. Now I understand what's really at stake. It's not just the mansion, it's a settling of accounts that began even before my birth. She walked to the window, observing the rain that was now diminishing, leaving a clear sky and a pale rainbow on the horizon, as if nature reflected the clarity that was beginning to form in her mind. Victor is willing to pay 10 million for the mansion. Her value absurdly above market. That's because he knows that with the mansion, he completes the puzzle of his adulterated properties. It legitimizes, retrospectively, the fraud he committed. And if you don't sell? He'll use all the weapons he has. He's already started, judicially contesting the donation, insinuating that my mother wasn't mentally capable. Elaine turned to face Michael. If he manages to invalidate the donation, the property reverts to me, and then I'll be vulnerable again to his pressures and threats. Michael approached, stopping a few steps away. You're not alone this time, Elaine. She studied him for a long moment, seeing not just the priest who stood before her, but also the man she had once loved with all intensity. A man who, like her, had been shaped by suffering and difficult choices. What do you suggest? Confront him. Use the document not to expose him publicly, but to force him to back down. A renewed stalemate on our terms. He's dangerous, Michael. Yes, but now we know what we're dealing with, and we have something he desperately wants. Elaine nodded slowly, a strategy beginning to form in her mind. We need allies. People who can't be easily intimidated or bought. The diocese. Michael smiled slightly. Victor may have influence over local authorities, but the church is an institution larger than him. And Matthew. Elaine picked up her cell phone. He knew my mother for decades. He probably knows more than he's revealed so far. As she dialed the lawyer's number, Elaine felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the warmth of hope replacing the cold of resignation. For the first time in 20 years, she wasn't just reacting to events, but taking the reins of her destiny. Matthew, it's me, Elaine. I found something you need to see, and I need you to tell me everything you know about Victor Reynolds and my father. The meeting room in Matthew Rivers' office was unexpectedly full that afternoon. Elaine occupied the head of the oval table, with Michael seated to her right and Matthew to her left. Bernice was also present, as well as two representatives from the diocese, Bishop August and his legal advisor, Dr. Campos. Everyone had before them copies of the documentation found by Elaine, as well as a dossier prepared by Matthew in the last 24 hours. So you knew, Elaine addressed Matthew after everyone had examined the documents. You knew about my mother's suspicion regarding my father's condition. The lawyer sighed heavily, running his hand through his graying hair. I suspected. Margaret was never explicit, but she asked questions over the years about criminal statutes of limitations, about how to prove poisoning after so much time. He paused. I never had concrete evidence, just intuitions based on disturbing coincidences. Like the fact that 3 people who opposed Victor in the last 30 years suffered similar vascular accidents, completed Bernice, pointing to a specific section of the dossier that Matthew had compiled. This isn't sufficient evidence in a court of law, interjected Dr. Campos, but it establishes a concerning pattern. Bishop August, who until then had listened in contemplative silence, finally spoke. The immediate question isn't proving past crimes, however serious they may be. It's protecting the community center and, more importantly, ensuring the safety of everyone involved. Elaine nodded, grateful for the bishop's objectivity. Exactly. Victor has already filed a lawsuit contesting the donation. Matthew believes he doesn't have a solid legal basis, but he can drag the process out for years, harming the center's operations in the meantime. He'll also try other tactics. Michael looked directly at Bishop August. He may try to have me transferred, using his influence in the diocese. The bishop smiled serenely. I've already received 3 calls from concerned benefactors suggesting you would be more useful in a distant parish. Fortunately, I've learned to recognize external interference in church affairs. So what's the plan? Asked Bernice, always practical. Elaine took a deep breath, mentally organizing the strategy she had developed during the night. We'll use his own weapons against him. She opened her laptop, showing a prepared presentation. First, the diocese will issue an official communication reaffirming the social value of the community center, highlighting the number of families benefited and the positive impact on the community. It's already being prepared, confirmed Dr. Campos. We'll include testimonials from people served and statistics from the last 5 years. Simultaneously, continued Elaine, I'll form a private foundation that will financially subsidize the center. As a businesswoman, I can attract corporate partners interested in social responsibility. This will shield the project against future attempts at economic destabilization, observed Matthew, approving the idea. Regarding the lawsuit, Elaine turned to the lawyer, we'll hire a specialized firm from Boston to assist you. I want Victor to know that we're willing to fight on all fronts. Everyone nodded, satisfied with the proactive approach. Only Michael seemed thoughtful, his gaze fixed on a distant point. This will strengthen our position, no doubt. He finally spoke. But Victor is persistent and has much to lose. Falsified documents, possible serious crimes. He won't back down easily. That's why we need the final confrontation. Elaine looked directly at Michael. A meeting with him where we'll show the original documents and offer an agreement. What kind of agreement? Asked Bishop August, frowning. He gives up all claims to the mansion and withdraws the lawsuit. In exchange, we don't disclose the documents that compromise the legitimacy of his other properties. A renewed stalemate, murmured Michael, recognizing the strategy. With one fundamental difference, this time we're united and prepared. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, refining details and anticipating possible reactions from Victor. When everyone stood to leave, Bishop August asked for a moment alone with Elaine and Michael. There's an issue we haven't addressed. The bishop looked from one to the other with a serene but penetrating expression. The shared past between you two. Elaine felt her face flush slightly, while Michael lowered his eyes. That won't affect our strategy, Bishop August, she assured. I'm not concerned about the strategy, my child. I'm concerned about you two. He sighed. Michael, you took sacred vows in a moment of great personal pain. Now, with Elaine back and the truth emerging, you need to reflect deeply on your vocation. Michael nodded gravely. I have been reflecting, Your Excellency, continuously. And you, Elaine, the bishop continued gently, need to decide what you really want after this battle ends. Remain in Clear Springs? Return to Boston? And what role will Michael have in your life, regardless of his vocational decision? I don't know, admitted Elaine, suddenly feeling vulnerable. I wasn't expecting an immediate answer. Bishop August smiled. I just want you to know that, whatever path you choose, you'll have my support. True love is a rare gift, even when it arrives at complicated moments. With these words, the bishop said goodbye, leaving them alone in the meeting room. A silence charged with unexpressed possibilities hung between them. He's right. Michael was the first to break the silence. We need to talk about us. First, Victor, replied Elaine, not out of evasion but pragmatism. Then, us. 2 days later, in the library of the mansion transformed into a community center, Elaine and Michael awaited Victor Reynolds' arrival. The environment had been strategically chosen, neutral enough for a negotiation, but symbolically powerful for representing everything that was at stake. When Victor entered, accompanied only by his lawyer, his confident expression faltered. Slightly upon seeing not only Elaine and Michael, but also Bishop August, Matthew, and an unknown lawyer in an impeccable suit whom Elaine had brought from Boston. What an interesting meeting, he commented, trying to maintain a light tone. I was expecting a more private conversation. Certain conversations are better conducted with witnesses, Mr. Reynolds, replied Elaine formally, indicating the chairs in front. The meeting that followed was tense and meticulously calculated. Elaine presented the original documents, calmly explained their legal implications, and finally outlined the terms of the proposed agreement. Victor oscillated between incredulity, contained anger, and finally calculated resignation. This is blackmail, he said finally. I prefer to call it pragmatic negotiation, responded Elaine, using the same words he had used days before. After all, everyone here has something to lose if this story becomes public, some more than others. After an hour of technical discussions among the lawyers, an agreement was drafted and signed. Victor would withdraw all lawsuits related to the mansion, formally renounce any future claim to the property, and make a significant, voluntary donation to the new foundation that would manage the community center. In exchange, the original documents would remain sealed. When Victor and his lawyer left, visibly displeased but without viable alternatives, a collective sigh of relief filled the library. Bishop August was the first to speak. May peace prevail from now on. In the days that followed, Elaine immersed herself in structuring the foundation. She met with local businesses, community associations, and representatives from the mayor's office. The community center would not only be preserved, but expanded. With new educational and professional training programs, Michael in turn began a spiritual retreat at Bishop August's advice. He needed to reflect deeply on his priestly vocation, whether it was a genuine calling or an escape from a painful past. Only on the eve of her scheduled return to Boston did Elaine finally visit the retreat where Michael was staying. They walked together through the silent gardens, letting the perfumed air of the beginning spring soften the difficulty of the conversation they needed to have. "I requested dispensation from my vows," said Michael finally, when they stopped by a small lake. "Bishop August is conducting the process with the Vatican." Elaine felt her heart accelerate, but contained any hasty reaction. "Is that what you really want?" "It's not that simple," he smiled sadly. "I love my pastoral work, the contact with the community, the feeling of making a difference. But I realized that I assumed the cassock partially as an escape, as protection. And vows made under those circumstances, even if fulfilled with dedication, lack full freedom. And now? Now I'm choosing with freedom, for the first time in 20 years. Michael turned to face her. "I'm not leaving the priesthood for you, Elaine. That would be an unfair burden for both of us. I'm leaving because I need to rediscover who I am, without threats, without fear, without escapes." Elaine nodded, understanding the depth of that decision. "I'm returning to Boston tomorrow. I have a company to run." "I know." But she continued, suddenly feeling vulnerable. "I'll be here frequently to oversee the foundation, and maybe we can rediscover who we are, together, without predefined expectations, just possibilities." Michael's smile gradually brightened, reaching his eyes in a way that Elaine hadn't seen in 2 decades. "I would like that very much." 6 months later, the Margaret Mitchell Community Center, now renamed in honor of its benefactor, celebrated. Its reopening after renovations and expansions. The entire community attended, including many of the families benefited by the social programs. Elaine, elegant in a simple blue dress, cut the inaugural ribbon alongside Bishop August. Among the crowd, she spotted Michael, no longer wearing the clerical collar, but an ordinary shirt. At his side, Bernice and her son applauded enthusiastically. The former priest now coordinated the foundation's educational projects, using his pastoral experience in a different but equally meaningful way. Elaine divided her time between Boston and Clear Springs, balancing her established career with the new purpose she had found in her hometown. As for the personal relationship between them, it evolved slowly, with the caution of those who know both the value of love and the cost of loss. Casual meetings for coffee, long phone conversations, and a growing comfort in each other's presence. Small steps of a reconciliation that, regardless of its final destination, already represented a victory over the past. That night after the celebrations, Elaine visited the cemetery, placing flowers on her parents' grave. The twilight painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, while a gentle breeze swayed the surrounding trees. "You were right," she murmured, touching the headstone affectionately. "Some things are more important than business. Some fights are worth it, and some loves. Some loves simply refuse to disappear, no matter how much time passes." As she left the cemetery, Elaine found Michael waiting at the gate, respecting her private moment. Without words, she extended her hand. And he accepted it. They walked together toward the illuminated mansion in the distance, no longer prisoners of the past, no longer fearful of the future. Just two survivors who had finally found their way back to each other and to themselves.